Welcome, everyone. We are letting everybody come in and filter in the room, but we're so thankful that you took the time to join us for this webinar today. I'm sure we will have more join as we go along here, but for the sake of time, I'm going to get right into it and get started with this presentation because I have some really new information hot off the press in the last month, actually, some information that was just launched July. And so I'm thrilled to be able to offer you that content and information. So without further ado, we'll get started. And of course, I'll introduce you to our Stand leadership team really quickly here as well. So this webinar, Stand in the Social Media Gap, Helping Youth Navigate the Online Environment, is a topic and presentation that I am very passionate about offering because I really, really love to educate adults and youth about this because I think it's really important. I'll talk more about kind of my background and where I come in, but this presentation is brought to you by Stand Against Trafficking Coalition, based out of Springfield, Missouri. The coalition has a mission to mobilize the community to end human trafficking in the Ozarks. And very briefly, we have 5 goals that we try to accomplish our mission through. We raise awareness doing things like webinars and community events, trainings at different locations, and then provide education to specific stakeholders and those in the field who are needing extra education and providing that. We do emphasize prevention. We believe in the idea of stopping something before it starts and being on the forward end of things to try to keep a problem from happening to begin with. We do promote very big on community collaboration and trying this become a community-owned issue. And so Stand Against Trafficking is all about that community collaboration. And then also in any way that we can support survivors. While Stand Against Trafficking as a coalition does not provide services to trafficking survivors, we do collaborate with many of the organizations that do. And so we can refer individuals to those organizations. So more about Stand towards the very end of the presentation. But I wanted to introduce you briefly to the Stand Against Trafficking chair, Susan Prine. She will be helping me to host this today. And then I believe also in the webinar, we have Erin Johnson, who serves as the secretary of the coalition. And we have Becky Spain, who serves as the treasurer of the coalition. And then myself as the ex officio. So we are excited to offer this to you today. In the chat, I would love if you would drop your name, your agency or organization, and where you're joining from. And where you're joining from, you're welcome to put in there your city, your state. You are welcome to put in there my couch or my desk, wherever you're coming from. Just like to get a feel for who's in the room with us today. I know that people are joining. So if you are just entering the room, please drop in the chat an introduction of who you are so I can say hello and know who's here with us. Thanks so much, Jennifer. It's great to have you. Wonderful. Thanks, Amy. Thanks, Maddie. Amy, Lisa, wonderful. People from all over Missouri. Great. Thank you so much, Danny. Okay. While those are coming in, I'm going to go ahead and just keep going through slides. But if you're still typing, please go ahead and still send your introduction so that we know who all is here with us today. And I'll just very briefly introduce myself so that you can kind of know why this lady named Ricky is talking to me. So Ricky Barton, I started a consulting company called Onward Consulting 3 years ago, but I have over 15 years of experience in the field of primary prevention. So what is primary prevention? It's really all about this upstream approach of trying to prevent issues like substance use, mental health challenges, suicide, and human trafficking in an upstream way. again, stopping the problem before it starts instead of mitigating the issues that are a result of those behavior choices and issues. So I've been in that field for over 15 years and serve as a trainer and consultant nationally across the US, and do a lot within different agencies and organizations to help communities identify the problems happening in their community and then come up with a strategic plan to address those. And so that is my work role, my day-to-day. However, I've been involved with Stand Against Trafficking since it started back in 2012. So Stand Against Trafficking, again, the coalition that is presenting this webinar based out of Springfield, Missouri. And the passion for human trafficking has been kind of in my blood. The passion for fighting human trafficking has been in my blood for over well over a decade. And I was part of the foundational team of Stand Against Trafficking. I've been on the leadership team ever since, because I just see this injustice happening in the world, and it's really important to me that we fight this injustice. And kind of I saw my worlds collide when I understood, especially the impact of what we're talking about today, social media, and how the influence of human trafficking, substance use, mental health challenges, and social media all create what could be a very potentially toxic combination for our young people. And one of the things I love the most in the world is young people and the potential that they have, and the way that we can build them to be leaders today and leaders tomorrow. And so I am just really passionate about trying to protect our youth and give them as many tools and resources as they need. So this specific training I've actually not done with youth, but I have done multiple trainings with youth that talk about this toxic combination. And when I can, I'll pepper in some of the feedback they've given throughout this presentation, because giving them that empowerment of this toxic combination helps them choose better for themselves as well as their peers, and to be models for their peers in that way. So today is really focused on how do we intervene in this arena. Just a couple housekeeping things real quick. So this is being recorded, and just want to make you all aware of that. I'll also ask you to be relatively active in the chat. I have a few slides where I'll ask you to do some interaction there. And that just, kind of helps us to root our knowledge and our understanding of what's going on. There's two ways also that you could ask questions. The first is, of course, you can ask questions in the chat, and Susan will be helping me monitor those, and we'll have time for questions and answers at the end. But if it's something relevant I can answer in that moment, I absolutely will. The second way is, you'll notice on your Zoom toolbar that there's a Q&A button. You can submit questions that way as well. That's a little bit of a better way, simply because they stay right there. Whereas when the chat's going, we may lose your question. So just two different options. You choose your best method, and we'll make sure that we try to get your questions answered. So today's agenda that we'll go through is, I'll talk to you about some of the facts around these four topics. Now, if you have watched any of the presentations I've done previously, it may look a little bit familiar. However, I do have some updated data and information. And then we'll talk about that toxic combination, some of the vulnerabilities that youth experience, and then finally, how do we stand in the gap? And that is where I will present some really, like I said at the very beginning, hot off the press, released in July information and a handbook. And then I'm going to send you out of here loaded up with resources on further educating yourself, researching, getting some best practices going on in your life for your family, as well as the work that you all are doing. And based on what I'm seeing in the chat, many of you are actively working in this field in some way, shape, or form. You're connected to this. And so I think some of those how-tos and ways to make this actionable information will really help you at the end. All right. So having said that and oriented you, it's kind of, I feel a little bit like a flight attendant there. If this is not the webinar you signed up for, you may exit now. We'll miss you, but I understand. But this is really an important topic, and I'm thankful for the time you all committed to being here today to listen. Where I like to start when I talk about this is a very, very important thing for us to realize and for us to know. That is that social media is not all bad. And I think that we need to really be intentional to understand, because research is starting to show that there are some really good things about social media. One, it connects us. We are actually more connected than any other generation before us. There are pros and cons to that, but for the most part, we are more connected and able to reach out to one another than we have been before. It also makes us laugh. I threw a meme on this slide because we've all been there. I remember as a child being told to clean my room because people were coming over, and I had that exact thought. Well, why? Are people going to come up to our bedrooms and snoop around, or what's happening? So the idea being, it makes us laugh. If there is a sixth love language, I have it. Sending memes, sending funny reels. That's what a lot of my loved ones and I go back and forth with. So it is something that entertains me very, very much. It also introduces us to new ideas and new perspectives. We are exposed to new information in a way that we haven't been before. Previously, before social media and before the internet, we had to base our knowledge on the information that was told to us and handed down to us by those closest to us. So family, friends, teachers, professors, going to the library, checking out books that were potentially years old, decades old. We were limited in our information. Now we have new ideas coming at us all the time. Again, pros and cons to that, but there are some pros. There are some good things about it. Next, it provides support. And I mean a few ways here. One, if you've got a hobby that you really like, you can find support groups and people who are also into that hobby or that interest, and you can get new ideas. I had someone in a webinar recently say on social media, she was able to learn all about the specific type of chickens that she has and ways to best feed them and care for them. And there's a whole chicken group that she was able to find, and that helped her with that hobby that she has. But it also provides support in ways like identifying issues through the algorithm, flagging words, flagging things were said that might be acts of violence towards self or others, or those suicidal thoughts. So there's a way that support's provided through these. Is it flawless? No, but there are ways that support is provided. And it gives a platform for creative expression. I like to create reels. People can post their artwork, and they kind of are able to be more exposed that way in terms of reaching a following. And so there's just a lot of creativity that can happen in a social media space. And then one of those kind of newer releases of information is that it can be really important. Social media can help youth who are marginalized or experiencing mental distress because of these issues, these benefits like connecting us and support, new ideas and perspectives. I think we're all more aware of celebrities who potentially are living with a mental illness and talk about it openly, such as Michael Phelps, which does a lot for normalizing getting help for mental health challenges, reducing stigma. So in some ways, it's really helpful to give that support to one another. But the reason why we were all here is there are consequences. And we're going to talk through those now. But I think it's really important just to anchor our minds that social media is not all bad. It's not an evil. It's a tool to be used. And that's what we're going to talk about, how we can use that tool after we get through some of the facts that we'll talk through. So interestingly, before we get into the facts around those four topics, there are some medical and long-term health issues that we're seeing as a result of social media and screen usage in general. One, strain to the eyes and body. We know that we're supposed to look away from a screen every hour or so and try to not have the blue light in our eyes because it keeps us up later. That speaks to that sleep deprivation. If we are holding a device, oftentimes we are neck down and hunched over, which is really bad posture. And so that affects our bodies. We're sitting for longer and potentially snacking mindlessly while we are either scrolling or gaming, and that increases that risk of obesity or type 2 diabetes. Brain science and researchers are starting to see that there appears to be a shrinking of the brain in those cognitive process areas, including poor concentration, memory, and impulse control, connected specifically to the use of technology and screens. There's also some delays in learning, particularly language development, and there's some thought behind why that's the case. There's the potential that when you're on social media and or texting, that usually shorthand is utilized, abbreviations, lack of punctuation, but also that it reduces the amount of actual face-to-face conversations, and therefore they're not developing the language skills that they would have. So some thoughts behind all of that. And then what I'm about to show you included kind of in the idea of delaying learning and influencing learning. And I found this on a Facebook post, and that is a teacher asked for her students to report every notification that went off during one class period time. And they kept track of it using this image where you see Facebook, Snapchat, emails, text messages, which is the bulk of those, phone calls, Instagram, Twitter, and then there is GroupMe and Discord in the middle there, and then other. So other might be apps for games and things like that. But just taking this in, I hope you're sitting there saying, wow, imagine this is a room full of maybe let's just assume, say, 25 students in a high school class period, and the amount of distractions that have popped up in that one 45-minute or hour-long class that would distract them from learning. And I know that many schools across the United States are working on a cell phone policy. I have heard from East Coast to West Coast of schools that are looking at their policies because this is such an issue now with the notifications. And so there's a lot to be said about that. That's not what this webinar is about, but just an interesting to note how there is some distraction happening in those class periods because of those phones. Continuing with talking about these different impacts, we do, of course, see a reduction in face-to-face contact, which can result in isolation, alienation, as we talked about, poor language development skills, impaired social skills and development. It's tougher for people who are raised in a world where technology and screens are so prevalent to learn how to have that eye-to-eye contact and that conversational dialogue with our, because we are used to communicating in short little sentences or paragraphs over text messages or Instagram comments. And so it is impairing some of that development for youth. If you know what FOMO is, drop it in the chat. What is FOMO? But social media is creating this culture of comparison. So what someone posts about their life is their best. It's their highlight reel. Whereas I'm looking at their highlight reel thinking, wow, their life is so much better than mine. If only people knew what I was really going through. But we don't want people to know what we're really going through. So we post our highlight reel and our, good parts of our life. And then someone else sees that and thinks, oh, that's such a good life. If only I know what. And it is a constant cycle of that comparison. And you got it, Kaylee and Becky, that fear of missing out. When we're scrolling and we see parties that are happening that maybe we weren't invited to, or we were invited to but not allowed to go, our parents said no, or we're looking at different vacations people have gone on, because we as adults are not exempt. We might look at someone's vacation this summer to Italy and think, oh, I hate that I'm, not able to do that, or I was invited on that trip, I couldn't go. And or you have this fear that you are missing out on so much. And so you get on social media to see what other people are doing. And that fear of missing out of activities drives us to anxiety and thinking that we're missing out on things. Again, a lot to be said about this, but we'll just touch on the fact that we're seeing an increase in the last decade of cyberbullying because of access to phones. And you've probably heard this before, that bullying used to be reserved to the school and the playground. But once students went home, they were able to get away from it. You could avoid the student that was bullying you in a lot of different ways, walk a different hallway, go a different way home. But the truth is that cyberspace has allowed those bullies to continue their torment online throughout the night, and that's taken a major toll on our youth, and honestly on our adults as well. We adults are no better. We bully online as well. And then there's this really interesting impact of targeted advertising through things like the algorithm amplifying content that is popular content or is most liked or is most extreme. And so we see that the more people comment, the more people share, the more people like, those get boosted and we see more of it. And a very non-violent but sort of violent example was, I think it was last week, I don't know who all on social media saw the video of the whale that kind of came up out of the water and capsized the boat. And the one person had to jump off the boat to kind of, before the boat sank. If you saw that, that's because this one person posted a video and that then got shared. Or there was the big blow up of the basin out in Yellowstone where the big black soot geyser went off, and one woman filmed that, posted on her social media. Well, it was all over and shared all over. That's a great example of what the algorithm does for us in terms of it shoves out content that they think we want based on our interests, based on our likes. It's in the same way as when you get on Netflix and it asks you to select shows you like, and then it also suggests other shows that you may want to watch based on what you have watched or liked. All of that is algorithm based. But what I share here on this slide is something like someone Googling or searching for on social media healthy eating habits might end up with content related to glorified eating disorders. It won't necessarily say, oh, well, to look that way, you have to get an eating disorder, but the content itself is very harmful and leads towards eating disorder type behavior and conduct. And so research is showing that there's a risk of exposure to inaccurate and harmful information. And I know that the term fake news is very politicized these days, but this is an actual threat online, that there is this risk of exposure to very inaccurate and harmful information. And our youth, our young people, our children are seeing that. And that can create an entire generation that has a different belief or different understanding of truth. And then connected also to that algorithm, there's recently been a video, and I'm not sure who would have seen this, but a video where a man and a woman filmed a video together. And the comments that were on her account and his account were completely different. And this has created a lot of spark and discussion around how there seems to be control from the algorithm point of view, or who is controlling the strings of what comments get shown. Now, there's, again, a lot to be said about that and unpacked there. But the point for this webinar is, what is it that our youth are being shown and seen? What's being prioritized for them and their eyes in a way that maybe we as adults don't see? And as we get later into this webinar, we're going to talk about what it looks like to have conversations with youth where we can get to the bottom of what they're seeing and really help to be a supportive, protective factor adult in their lives in order to help mitigate some of this information that might be coming their way. And connected to all of this is the idea that we're seeing through brain scans and all of the things that the smart people research. The brain is responding to social media in the same way that it responds to a drug. What you see on your screen here is from the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and essentially a nice little picture or diagram of what it looks like when the brain receives that dopamine release from a good thing like food on the left. You see the little, yellow, orange circles, spheres. Those are the dopamine being released, and they connect to the receptor in your brain, and it makes us feel good. So when we have good food or, pleasurable experiences, dopamine gets released in our system. That's by design. That is how our bodies operate. That creates a desire in us to eat food again. And we know that food sustains us. So there's this reward system. Hey, I eat food, I feel good. I'll eat food again, I feel good. And that's what enables us to carry on in life, not be hungry. But on the right side, what we see is the dopamine that's released when cocaine is introduced to the body, into the brain. We see it as flooded with dopamine. And if you're familiar with addiction research, the brain over time becomes very reliant on the dopamine that's released because of that substance, so much so that it floods the pathways, and then the body has to kind of say, whoa, 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 okay, I'm not going to make dopamine for a while. That was a lot of dopamine. I got to back off. And so your body goes into this dysregulation of dopamine release. And that's why substance use can become such an issue and lead to substance use disorder, because the body, the brain literally needs to continue using that substance to get that feeling. And eventually you need that just to feel normal. And so all of that to say, social media is doing the same thing to our brains. Your brain to my brain. If you wear a smartwatch, you are essentially hooked up to a dopamine administration system, because every time your wrist vibrates with a notification, your brain does a little bit of dopamine. Now, that could be a benign notification. It could be a notification that pops up and says, hey, there's thunderstorms on their way towards you. It's nothing that you would necessarily think anything of. but it doesn't matter because your brain has received reward before. When you get that vibration and it's a text message from a loved one or a funny meme or a phone call, so our bodies are starting to become programmed to wanting that. And I'm talking about a watch, but that's the same way for your phone. If you notice that you are kind of picking up your phone to check it because you haven't heard a vibration or heard a ding in a while, that's probably because your body's actually craving that dopamine hit. It's thinking to itself, I haven't had dopamine in a little bit. We probably got a notification. I should go check it. When we're watching content, when we're scrolling, when we get likes, when people comment, all of those things are releasing that dopamine because it makes us feel good. It tells us we're valuable. It tells us we posted something worthwhile and beneficial. None of this is inherently bad, but we need to understand that for the youth brain specifically, that is still in development until age 25, if we are giving them devices that creates this loop of dopamine rushes and then desiring dopamine and needing another dopamine hit, we're creating this addiction, this socially acceptable addiction to technology, whether that's through gaming, text messages, cell phones, iPads, movies on screens, whatever. We're creating this cyclical issue in a developing brain. And if you know much about the brain, you know, the neural pathways, they build and grow the more that they are used. A brain scientist once said that those that fire together wire together. So as we continually fire different neural pathways and neurons, those become stronger. And we prune out the things we don't need anymore. Maybe like how to have those, you know, social skills and eye-to-eye contact. So this is important just to root our understanding that not only are we as adults also caught in this loop, but that our young people with developing brains 25 and under are also caught in this loop. And that could create some development issues in terms of actual brain structure and reliance. So if you're willing to be vulnerable, I would love for you to share in the chat what impact you've seen from social media in your own life. This could be positive. This could be negative. What types of like good or bad things have you noticed in your own life when it comes to social media? I will tell you that I am an avid outdoor hiker. And so I've been able to find many groups that do, you know, if I'm planning for a specific hike, I've been able to find groups that have done that before or are planning to. And those groups are super helpful to me because I learn what I need to pack, what I need to prepare for, what kind of elements I need to expect when I'm out there. So those have been really beneficial to me. But I also am very aware that I am susceptible to the need for approval. I post a reel, how many likes have I had? Is it something that's making people laugh or is it kind of a flop? And so I'm just being honest. There's positive and negative for me in that way. Danielle, support groups for sharing recipes for dairy-free infant. That is amazing. That's amazing. And again, that's content that we didn't really have 15 years ago, before smartphones and before we were able to kind of connect with one another in these ways. So that's a really neat benefit to having that social media. Thank you for those who are sharing. Kaylee says, yeah, felt the pull of social media, checking the phone when I know it hasn't gone off. Absolutely. That is a shared experience for sure. And taking those apps off your phones can be freeing. And we'll talk more about that towards the end as a solution, but you can also set time limits on specific apps. If you've been on it for an hour in that day, it doesn't let you open that app again. Online shopping deals are dangerous. I will tell you, the algorithm knows me pretty well, and I am constantly buying things that are advertised to me on Instagram. It's a problem. Maddie took a break from social media for a year. Amazing, because of that FOMO. I found some great groups to talk to. Amazing. I love to see that. Knowing what sports events are upcoming, yeah, makes you feel like, yes, you have to do it all. It gives you that almost anxiety of like, yeah, like we got to go do these things. We got to have this. Absolutely. And Amy says time loss. Yeah. Thank you for sharing, those who put that in the chat. It's helpful to reflect on ourselves. It's helpful to just be acknowledging to the, you know, ways that this is actually impacting us. Because if we're honest about us, then we're going to be better about having honest conversations with young people in our lives. All right. So let's talk through the facts. What you'll notice throughout this presentation is I use this image to talk through our toxic combination of these 4 topics. So at the top right of the following slides, you'll see which specific topic we are talking about. And then as we get into the combinations, you'll see how I show those. This is just a visual way for you to follow along with the ways that these different topics kind of come together and overlap with one another. So we'll start with mental health and the facts around mental health. These are statistics from the, from several different sources. You can see those on your slide, but they're from 2021, 2020. So a little bit dated at this point, but not too bad. But essentially, we know that when it comes to a mental health disorder, about 1 in 5 adults, 1 in 5 youth will experience a mental health challenge in any given year. So that's that 20% we're seeing there. When it comes to youth, across the US, 12.7% reported seriously considering suicide. So that's more than 1 in 10 of our youth have seriously considered suicide in the past year. And of those, 6% have made a plan. Just for those of you who aren't aware, if a student talks about considering suicide but hasn't made a plan, that doesn't mean that they aren't intending to. But when we do hear that they've made a plan, that does make that a very clear indication that they are going to attempt unless there's an intervention. So that's why that statistic there is important. We know from different sources that depression, anxiety, and behavioral disorders are leading causes of illness and disability in our world, in the United States. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for 10 to 14-year-olds and third leading cause of death for 15 to 24-year-olds. And then suicide rates for teenage girls are the highest point it's been in 40 years. So these help us anchor our understanding that we certainly have a mental health issue happening here in the US. And I'm going to keep moving quickly through these just so we can get to the end where I give you the real meat and potatoes of what we can do. When it comes to drug use, again, this is from Monitoring the Future in 2022. So good new data here. We know that cannabis, vaping, nicotine, and alcohol are the top 3 substances used by youth. And I won't go number by number here. I do list on this slide how that has changed throughout the pandemic, because that was for those of us in the prevention field, we were very closely monitoring what youth were reporting in terms of substance use during the pandemic. Did they have more access, less access, more use, less use? So you can see that here on this slide. But we see about 1 in 3 United States 12th graders have used cannabis in the past year. 27%, almost 1 in 3, kind of a little bit more than 1 in 4 vapes nicotine. And over half of our 12th graders have used alcohol in the past year. And again, I put on here just that note and call back to the slide that talked about the brain science of addiction and how the brain develops those neural pathways when substance is used consistently. That's why in prevention work, we delay the onset of use as much as possible. We're working to delay when students start using substances as much as possible, encouraging that. Typically, depending on the substance, 11, 12, 13 is a pretty typical age that youth report first trying alcohol, cannabis, or nicotine of some kind. Then when it comes to social media, my friends, I put us on here because we need to be held accountable as well. As I said earlier, social media and gaming is a very socially acceptable addiction, but this helps us to see just how much we are on it. That 44 years of our lives will be spent staring at screens. I believe how they came to that conclusion was that they extrapolated average age, like lifespan, and then kind of looked at how much time per day we are oftentimes on screens versus waking hours. And that's where that comes from, is those 44 years of our lives will be spent staring at screens. That's not just a cell phone. That includes the computer you're looking at right now, the TV that you'll watch tonight, those sorts of things, the Olympics and how you're watching those, right? That all adds to that. But we typically spend 4 to 6 hours a day on our smartphones, and 2 hours plus of those are on social media. And again, this is an average. US teens spend about 9 hours a day on screens. Now, granted, sometimes that does incorporate that they use a device like a Chromebook at school. So that does take that into account. But You'll see here what's listed below that: 3 hours and 16 minutes of videos, an hour and 45 of games, and an hour and a half of social media. However, just recently, last year, the US Surgeon General released an advisory around social media and mental health. And in that, he shares a study that says teens actually spend more like 3.5 hours a day on social media. And that will be important when we get to our toxic combination here. So I'm going to challenge you, if you feel like doing so. You were so great to be vulnerable in the chat earlier. But if you want to pick up your phone real quick, you can go to follow these steps, go to your settings. And I believe that's correct for Android. I'm an iPhone user, so I know for sure going to screen time and see all activity will tell me how many hours on average per day I'm on my phone or in my apps. Android, I think that's how you get there. If you're interested, you can go ahead and share that in the chat. This is usually pretty eye-opening for people because you may not be aware of just how much time you actually are spending on your phone, as well as specific apps and which apps you spend the most time on. Haley said 3 hours and 25 minutes. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Anyone else want to drop yours? You're welcome to. I'm sure you're scrolling through trying to look at it right now. So drop that in the chat. But I think, again, this is just helpful for us to identify so that we can also understand in our conversations with youth that we're not above them. We're not better than them. We are in this fight against the time suck that is coming from phones and social media in the same way they are. Carol says today is 59 minutes, but low average. Yeah, I'm only about halfway through the day. So yeah, interesting. Yeah, and I find too, if I'm at a conference, I'm not on my phone as much. Whereas if I'm home working, I pick it up way more often when I'm at my desk and just working. So yeah, interesting there too. And then, so continuing with our facts on social media, and I put the sources here for each of these, but we've got about 82% of American adults, 30 and younger, who use some type of social media. They say about 4.8 or 4.5 billion people in the world have a social media account. The average age that a child opens a social media account is 12 and a half years old. The reason why that is important is because the vast bulk of apps that are out there, social media apps, are supposed to have the requirement of 13 to open an account. We, of course, know that youth lie about their ages in creating those accounts. So we'll get to this later, but that is one of the solutions, is having tech companies be held accountable to verify ages of those students that are creating accounts. But average is about 12 and a half, which means students who are younger than 12 and a half are also creating social media accounts. And then you see there the various uses for social media that people report. And that tracks with what we probably have experienced. And then finally, some facts from social media here that about 95% of teenagers and 40% of children 8 to 12 use some form of social media. That's that information that was just released last month, which I'll share that resource with you at the end. By age 10, 40% of youth have their own smartphone, not mom and dad sharing a phone, but rather their own. And I just find this statistic so interesting that the average screen time for all of us has increased by 50 minutes since 2012. My friends, we are not now operating on a 25-hour day. We are still operating on a 24-hour day. And yet we've lost 50 of those 24 hours, 1 hour of those 24 hours to screens. So we've lost an entire hour of our days to screens more than we did back in 2012. Just an interesting note. On here, there's also some information from Vision Direct that talks about the top apps that youth users use by the number of youth users. On the left, YouTube, TikTok, and Spotify. When I've presented this to youth, I actually give them a Mentimeter and have them rate their top 3. And it usually tracks pretty closely with this. However, they argue this statistic with me because they say, well, Spotify isn't really an app that we use. We just like turn on music and then we go to a different app. And I'm like, okay, that's fair. I get that. So they argue that Snapchat should be in that third spot there. And then on the right side, down at the bottom here, is the top apps by the number of minutes that youth use them. That's TikTok is number 1, YouTube is number 2, and Roblox is number 3, which is a gaming app. So interesting information there. All right, let's talk briefly here as I introduce the concept of human trafficking, and then we're going to get into this toxic combination. So for those who don't kind of know the definition of trafficking, it's essentially recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person to exploit them by using force, fraud, or coercion so that you get either a labor or commercial sex or some kind of service. So there's labor trafficking, there's sex trafficking, and within those, that occurs in a lot of different arenas. But I do note here on this slide, when it comes to minors, to our young people, you do not have to prove force, fraud, or coercion for that to be considered trafficking. And that is because the understanding is that young people do not have the capacity to give consent to those behaviors, which is why as an adult, you do have to prove force, that you were forced to do it, you were tricked or frauded into do it, or coerced in some way by some sort of either benefit or consequence of you not doing that. It is the second largest criminal enterprise in the world, and it is second only to the sale of drugs and guns. And the reason, well, it's also the fastest growing criminal enterprise. And the reason for that is, and I'll just say this briefly, and it's an icky thing to say, but the number one reason why it's the fastest growing is because if I'm selling cocaine and I sell it, my product is gone. I'm able to go replenish my stock of cocaine, but once it is sold, it is gone. I no longer have my product. When I sell a human being, whether that's for commercial sex or for labor, I can reuse that person's body over and over and over again. There's an endless supply of that product unless that person gets sick or dies. So then my job is just to keep them well, and that's it. I can use that person for a very long time. So icky thing to think about. The second reason why it's a very fast growing enterprise is because it's also very easy to explain away a person in my back seat, a young person in my back seat, than it is to explain a trunk full of cocaine. If I get pulled over and I have a trunk full of cocaine, you got me, I'm going to jail. But if I have a young person in my back seat, I can say, oh, well, I'm his aunt. I'm just taking him to see his grandma up in St. Louis. I'm just taking him up there. And if I've done my job as a trafficker of grooming that individual, they will corroborate my story and will be let go. So it's a lot easier to explain away a human than it is to explain away a car full of that. So the criminal enterprises are realizing, I hate to say this word, but it is a lucrative industry to get into in terms of human trafficking. There are a couple different types of trafficking, especially when it comes to sex trafficking. There's the idea when it relates to youth, especially they're vulnerable to the Romeo or the lover boy tactic, where an individual who's maybe older might try to kind of romance and love bomb and schmooze someone into a romantic relationship. And then they start asking for some sexual favors or some photos. And then from there, sextortion or some kind of exploitation happens as a result of that. Gorilla, spelled one or two ways. It can be spelled either way to describe this, but essentially that's kind of what we would think of when we think of like a brute force, violence is the enforcer type of trafficking. If I do wrong or I don't comply, I may be physically beaten, or they may physically beat someone else and it's my fault. And so they use that as a way to gain control and authority over my decisions. And then another really tough one to talk about is familial trafficking, where family members, whether immediate family or extended family, are selling younger family members or disabled family members for money, for favors, for social kind of status or symbol in whatever community that they live in. I do like to make this point that many of us may have seen the movie Taken, although it's kind of a little bit dated at this point. I've been in this field for 12 years, so it's a little bit dated at this point. I think that came out in 2008 maybe, but it's not like that. Does that happen where a female might be on the streets of a foreign country and get literally snatched and thrown in a van, never to be seen again until Liam Neeson shows up? Yes, that can happen. But the truth is that there are youth living in your community right now, going to school and living at home with their parents, who are being trafficked, who are being sextorted. And so this is an issue that's happening in communities everywhere, whether you are rural, urban, suburban, whether you live in a wealthy area or an impoverished area, trafficking is happening in your community. So that is a brief touch there on that. Again, we've got some training. Stand Against Trafficking has various trainings that we can offer to go more in depth into the trafficking component. But what we're here to talk about today is this toxic mixture that we have brewing. So as I said, we'll use these symbols as we go through this to sort of help identify where these toxic combinations are happening. The very first of which, we're going to talk about drug use and mental health. We understand that individuals oftentimes use drugs to cope with mental health challenges. They use it to numb themselves from what they're feeling or get them to feel something different. Maybe even if they have a lot of social anxiety, they would have some drinks in order to calm down before they go to a social event. So we just see substances being used in that method to cope. Doesn't always have to be in an extreme way, but it could be. And so that's important to note. I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but the idea that use of substances actually changes the physiological structure of the brain in terms of the neural pathways that are strengthened and enforced and widened, if you will, if you think about a roadway system in your brain, because of that dopamine hit and the things that are released that make us feel good. So the more we use these substances and cope with those mental health challenges, it actually changes the structure of our brain. Substance use itself can actually be the lead to mental health challenges like depression, anxiety, aggression, hallucinations. And we also know in this toxic combination that that could also be an initiation into trafficking. Traffickers may use someone's mental health challenges and or substance use issues to kind of either hook them in. I love you, I care about you, kind of love bombing stuff. We'll talk about grooming in a second, but also, hey, I'll buy a keg for you and your friends to have a party, and sort of developing relationship that way. In continuing this, this is data from the Missouri Student Survey. Every 2 years, students across Missouri are surveyed in schools. And so this, I worked with an epidemiologist to take the information from students who did report seriously considering suicide in the past year and compare that with students who didn't and the substance use they reported. And as you can see here on the slide, students who are seriously considering suicide are far more likely to use substances in the past month. So alcohol, they're 3.2 times more likely to use alcohol. Those seriously considering suicide are 3.4 times more likely to use marijuana. And those seriously considering suicide are 12 times more likely to misuse prescription drugs. And then 1 in 5 Missouri 10th graders report misusing prescription drugs to help them feel better or happier. So again, this helps us to solidify this toxic combination happening here between drugs and mental health. And then this data is a little bit dated. I was not able to find updated data on these ones specifically, but we do see a direct connection to suicide deaths and having these substances in the system. We know, of course, that substance use reduces inhibitions and creates maybe more impulsive choices. And so that may lead, if substance use is happening in a depressive state or an overly anxious state or some sort of mental health challenge, it may lead to them feeling that suicide is the only answer and attempting and then dying by suicide. Let's shift to talking about the toxic combination when it comes to drug use and social media. This is fascinating to me. The Columbia University did a study where they just looked at whether or not teens have social media or not, and how more likely they are to buy or use substances. And as you can see here, just merely having a social media account makes them 5 times more likely to buy cigarettes, 3 times more likely to drink alcohol, and 2 times more likely to use marijuana. Again, a lot of thought and theory behind this idea, but likely just being on social media exposes them to more norms around that, norms of use. Maybe they're seeing celebrities using and drinking, friends using and drinking. The different ads probably have alcohol in them, or the different videos they come across. So they're likely to see more that enables the behavior and encourages it. But I also mentioned this on this slide, that social media also has become a source of substances for youth. I have heard from people all across the United States that youth are meeting dealers in a social media-like environment and arranging for some sort of meetup to get those substances, and then they're meeting that way. And so they're actually initiating that conversation on social media. And so, certain users get a reputation of being a good dealer with good stuff. And so therefore their name gets out there better and faster and quicker to a more broad audience. We've seen that 75% of teens that do see social media photos of other young people either smoking weed or drinking encourages them. They report that they like want to do the same. They want to try those things. And then social media ads, we mentioned the algorithm earlier. Exposure to substance use ads is very much correlated with starting to use. And so if we can implement strategies to reduce the number of ads that promote vapes, promote alcohol, promote cannabis, especially ones that are being targeted towards those 21 and under, that would help us a lot. But social media ads are pretty tough to regulate currently. That's some of the recommendations we'll get to in a little bit. But also, some of these aren't ads. Some of these are just merely exposure to content that other users have posted that has not been flagged, has not been screened, has not been vetted. And so it's just out there for others to see. Moving into the next toxic combination of social media with mental health, we see a direct connection between social media and anxiety, depression, and loneliness. We kind of already touched on the FOMO idea, but we're seeing other people doing these things and it makes us feel lonely, makes us feel isolated, disrupted sleep, delayed sleep, sometimes because we're maybe on our phones very late at night. We'll get in bed, we start scrolling, and all of a sudden an hour has passed and we don't know it. Or we wake up in the middle of the night, we pick up our phone, we see some notifications, we address those, and then we get back on social media. And so we may have that delayed sleep, but that is connected to memory loss, depression, and poor academic performance. And this statistic is interesting, that youth who spend 3+ hours a day on social media face 2 times the risk of experiencing poor mental health outcomes. That came from the US Surgeon General's advisory. And if you remember on a previous slide, I said that in that advisory, he also shares a statistic that youth are spending about 3.5 hours per day on social media on average. So you see these two connect, that then the majority of youth, because they are spending 3.5 hours on social media, are at 2 times the risk of experiencing poor mental health outcomes. And we see that youth are often or sometimes exposed to hate-based content as well. So this connection too of not just being on social media, but the more time we spend on social media, the more likely we are to experience that. So a quick 15-minute perusal of some social media, not so bad. I can get on there, I can get my quick updates on the sporting events that are happening, and then I get off and move on with my life. But if I'm on there for 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour and a half, the longer that time goes on, the more likely I am to develop those symptoms. And so that's one of the things that I stress when I present this to youth is you got to do a body scan every once in a while. If you're on your phone, think to yourself, how am I feeling right now? What's my body telling me? Do I feel slumped? Do I feel sad? Is my face saggy and frowning, or like furrowed brow? Or what are we reacting to physically and mentally from what we're seeing online in that space? Whether we like it or not, we are impacted by the comments, the shares, the likes, and we compare that. I know that Instagram allowed for a setting to be made where you can't see the number of likes. However, it's kind of one of those, it became kind of a socially taboo thing to do, because as people tried to do that, it kind of became like, oh, they just don't want us to see that they don't have a lot of likes. And so it almost became socially taboo to set that setting as yours. So again, good intention, but didn't necessarily land. We already talked about this bullying issue, but what's really interesting to me is some of this discussion around how the youth's brain is still developing, as I said, until the age of 25. So these filters and the angles at which things are being taken are creating sort of a lack of awareness of reality in that youth's developing brain. Now, hear me, I'm not saying that they think that the Snapchat filter with the dog ears and the tongue is reality, but the filters that are out there are seen to sort of confuse the teen's brain and body on what is real life. What is smooth skin versus, porous skin, like there's just a lot out there around that. And AI is very much connected to this as well. We talk a little bit about that towards the end of this, but there's a whole lot to unpack if we're talking about AI. But I want to give you a quick lesson in AI when it comes to even us as adults. On Facebook, this was probably about a year ago, everyone was sharing this photo of this adorable baby peacock. Are you ready to see it? Oh my goodness, look how cute he is. I mean, he's just so cute, right? He's got these beautiful little marbly eyes, all these colors on his little feathers, and he's just so cute and petite and little. We're all just like, oh, and everyone was sharing, oh my goodness, isn't this so cute, this little baby peacock? And I looked at that image and I thought, there is no way. That is AI all the way, because I have a little bit of a trained eye because of what I do in this work and in this field. So I went on the old Google machine and I Googled baby peacock. My friends, this is a baby peacock in real life. So we can see very clearly it is not the image that we're seeing on the left. That is an AI generated image. But people were buying into it, that was a baby peacock. That's what they look like when they're just hatched out of their little egg. And yet it's still cute, but a brown little blob that hasn't become brilliant yet. So it's interesting to note that many of us as adults are having trouble with distinguishing AI. And there's been issues with this in connection to human trafficking, which I'll mention in just a second, but images of nudes being created in AI of actual students at high schools that have resulted in suicides, that have resulted in violent acts because images were shared of an individual. And this happened to Taylor Swift, of all people. There were images shared of Taylor Swift nude that were not her. They just AI imaged her face onto that, and it was all over the black web. And so that is dark web, sorry. But that is just an indicator this can happen to any of us and all of us. And so youth in our communities are at risk of having an innocent photo of them where they were clothed, taken and made into a very inappropriate image using AI. We'll talk more about that towards the end and some solutions. But let's add in our trafficking piece here. Our good friend Russ Tuttle with the Stop Trafficking Project always uses this phrase. He said that human trafficking is about exploitation of vulnerability. So what we see is that traffickers use vulnerabilities they've identified in our youth, especially in an online environment, and they then exploit those once they have the trust of that youth. So they use various methods of online, whether we're talking about gaming platforms and social media, to recruit, to build relationship with youth. And then sextortion, which I mentioned just a second ago briefly, is this idea of there may be a nude photo that a student has sent another student. Maybe they're in a relationship with one another. They shared it in confidence. Then that gets shared or that gets used as a method of control. Now you have to send me more, or I'm going to send that picture to your parents. I'm going to blast it out to your school. All of your friends will see that picture. And there have been cases where the sextortion was getting so bad that the trafficker was able to have that youth do sexual acts with their animals in their house and all sorts of things because they used this blackmail against a student in that way. And finally, the student was able to come forward to a parent and confess what was going on. And they used IP addresses to find this person, and that person was charged. But this was several years ago, but there's just this building of that issue. And the Online Health and Safety for Children and Youth document that I'll refer to, that's what was released in July. They share that more than 20 minors as of this point, all U.S. teenage boys, have died by suicide as a consequence of sextortion. And in Missouri, close to Springfield, there was a recent story in which that did take place. So this is very real. This is very relevant in communities near you. So I mentioned vulnerabilities. The exploitation of vulnerabilities are more vulnerable for several reasons. I'm listing 5 major ones here. That there's social isolation. They're looking for social isolation. Oh, I don't have a lot of friends. My friends don't like me. I'm going to fight with my friends. I'm just not someone who has a lot of friends at school. If a trafficker is starting a conversation online with someone, they're going to ask about friends. They're going to ask about their social life to try to see if there are any vulnerabilities around that with social isolation and loneliness. Are you lonely? Do you feel, sad at nighttime when you're home alone? Is there family distress happening in the home? And that could be something as serious as my parents are divorced or divorcing or splitting. There's a lot of yelling and fighting in my family to my sibling drives me crazy and I can't stand them and they get all the attention and I get none. All of that is family distress that a trafficker will pick up on and start to prey into that. Low self-esteem. They look for students who have very low self-esteem, low self-worth, don't think very much of themselves, because they can speak to that and build trust and rapport by complimenting them, by giving them that confidence in themselves. And traffickers are also looking for things like desires and deficits. What desires does this student have, or what deficits are they telling me that they have, and how can I meet that? And a deficit could be, oh, I'm, not able to buy, Chick-fil-A at the high school cafeteria. All my friends get Chick-fil-A, but I just have to come with a sandwich my mom made me. Oh, well, I'll buy you Chick-fil-A. Or it could be a true deficit of low socioeconomic status. Well, what if I could start buying you nice things that you want? Nice car, nice clothes, nice jewelry. And desires are important to note that, and deficits truly, that it's all really by definition of the user, and traffickers are very much in tune with how they listen for desires and deficits. And an example that Russ Tuttle has shared in his presentations was a teenage girl who turned 16, and she came from a more affluent family, and she posted on her 16th birthday the BMW that her dad bought her, posed next to it, and look what daddy got me for my birthday. I just didn't get the Prada purse or the Gucci purse. I forget which brand it was. And kind of sad face, which many of us might roll our eyes and say, oh, okay, you didn't get the Gucci purse, but you got a BMW. But to her, that was a deficit and a desire. And a trafficker picked up on that, and they messaged her. This is a true story. They messaged her and started a relationship with her. Oh, I would get you a Gucci purse. And that piqued her interest. So she continued this conversation, and it got down the road far enough that there was some trafficking that happened, but then she was able to come out of that situation and is alive and well. And Russ has actually worked with her. But I share that to say desires and deficits differ between different youth and different students, but traffickers are programmed to listen for that. So then starts this grooming process where they get information. They're asking questions. They're not drilling. Traffickers are very socially apt. They are going to ask questions that are appropriate to ask. How was school today? Who'd you sit with at lunch? What's your family up to tonight? Questions that are very benign. But they're doing that to get information that then they can use to exploit. They're looking for those vulnerabilities. So they build trust. They speak to the vulnerability, or they say that they'll provide better support. Then they might begin to exploit. They might ask for a picture or a sexual favor. If it becomes a physical relationship, they might ask for a sexual favor. But then it becomes more, and they ask for more, and that blackmail starts. And I put on here the role of pornography because pornography shows up in trafficking in two main ways. One is traffickers often will use pornography to desensitize their victims into either thinking that certain sexual acts are normal or maybe acceptable to the masses, and to sort of deprogram some of the more violent content around pornography. And also just pique their interest in sexual behaviors. But also pornography shows up in the sense that many times we see that human trafficking victims are actually the stars of pornography. They're there not by choice, or they're being forced to do certain acts against their will. And so there's a lot to be said about all of that, but there is a role that pornography plays in this human trafficking and in this toxic combination. And then, as I mentioned earlier, traffickers may use substances to either lure and groom. I'll buy you beer. You want some pot? But they also then may use that as their chains. If they get them, kind of hooked on some maybe stronger drugs, stimulants, and things like that, that might make them more susceptible to continuing that relationship. And there is the issue of trauma bonding, or some of you may be familiar with the idea of Stockholm syndrome, where as individuals are building relationships with traffickers, they may actually find that they sympathize with the trafficker, that they have built a connection and bond to them. And there's a lot to be said about that. But since we're just scratching the surface in this webinar, it is something to note, and that there is a cycle behind that. And it's a real thing. And so individuals who are coming out of trafficking situations sometimes do have to work through the trauma bonding that happened there with their abuser. A quick note on just signs to look for, because I don't want you all to not know these, but this is not necessarily the focus of this webinar, but it is important for you just to look through these and see what different signs there might be of this toxic combination happening in youth that are in your life in some way, shape, or form. So excessive use of devices, there may be secretive behaviors if they're on their device and you come over or walk behind them and they quickly jump or try to hide their screen or turn off their screen real quick. There may be an indication they're trying to hide something from you. If they leave home without any explanation, you don't know where they're at, skipping school, being disruptive in school. If they have items that are way more expensive than they should have, given their age and their status in life, if they have new phone numbers, contacts, email addresses, if they have a lot of different messages coming in, calls, texts, it's just a lot happening. That's rare and really for any adolescent, probably not likely. Text, yes, but again, it depends on with who. Breakdown of relationships. We see this with mental health challenges that they typically isolate themselves. But as you saw, isolation also plays into drug use, also plays in because of social media and human trafficking. So that is a huge indicator to look for, is that isolation and breakdown of relationships. If we see them sleeping a lot, sleeping a little, eating a lot, eating a little, that could demonstrate that they're processing through some emotions there. If you notice changes in their attitude, if they appear upset, withdrawn, angry, moody, aggressive after being on a device, that could be an indicator of a lot of these different things. This is not just trafficking, but too much time on social media, and they might get a little bit sassy afterwards. And of course, if we're seeing signs of substance use. Connected to this toxic combination, I thought that it was really interesting. Earlier this year, the U.S. Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, he actually announced he wrote for a New York Times op-ed piece, and he actually stated that he called for a warning label on social media in the same way we have warning labels on alcohol related to pregnancy and cigarettes related to cancers. He stressed that Congress should pass a requirement that reminds parents and adolescents that social media has not been proven safe. This is the big deal. And you might think to yourself, well, how would that even work? But then you think, okay, if you are someone who consumes alcohol, you probably don't even notice or recognize that there's warning labels on these things. But if we had a social media ad that maybe popped up every time we opened an app, we probably would pay attention to it, probably would see it. So it's just an interesting concept. And one of the resources I'm going to share with you at the very end is his advisory on social media and mental health for youth. And so I'll make sure that you get that. That one's about 25 pages and it's really good. It's really pretty succinct. Even though it's 25 pages, it's really well done to highlight some data, highlight some issues, and some actions that are called for. So the point of this webinar is to say, we have to do something at this intersection of these four topics. We need strategies that will help to promote the good things about social media and behaviors around it and address these issues that we see emerging. And so we see solutions from a lot of sources, and I'm going to summarize them here, and we're going to walk through some different ones. I'm going to get some input from you all. So get your fingertips ready for some typing. But prevention science, I mentioned earlier what primary prevention is. Prevention science talks about the idea of risk and protective factors, and we're about to get into that. But the idea that there are things that put people at higher risk of behaviors and things that protect them from those risk factors. And we use prevention science to understand how to intervene with this issue. The online health and safety for children and youth guide that I have mentioned multiple times. I'll make sure that I share that with you, but a lot of the content I'm about to talk about comes from that. So I'll make sure to reference that and then send you in the chat that PDF at the very end, and as well as the U.S. Surgeon General's social media and youth mental health advisory. I'll share that as a PDF, and then other various research some of which I've already mentioned. So I talked about this risk and protective factor idea here. What puts an individual at higher risk of a certain behavior or a consequence of a behavior, as well as protective factors. These can both occur within either an individual level, such as a risk factor is low self-esteem for both mental health challenges, substance use, and human trafficking. That's an individual-based risk factor. So if I'm a person who just inherently has lower self-esteem, I'm at higher risk of using substances, higher risk of a mental health challenge, higher risk of being maybe recruited into trafficking. On the flip side, a protective factor would be if I have high self-esteem, high confidence, high resiliency, self-efficacy. Those are protective factors. Risk factors can also occur within a family setting. There's familial risk and protective factors. And actually, let me go ahead and pull up the next slide because I'm kind of already mentioning these. Family management problems is a risk factor. So when I say that, I mean things like failure to set clear expectations for children, failure to supervise and monitor children, inconsistent or extremely punitive punishment. Those are risk factors. So, that's that whole like, oh, well, if you do this, then you'll get this consequence. Well, if the consequence isn't upheld, then that student then learns that they can get away with that. And so that over time will create sort of this, well, I can push the boundaries no matter what, and I'll be fine. I won't get in trouble. So that can create this climate of experimenting with substances, maybe mental health challenges, risky sexual behavior that could lead to trafficking. Family conflict, like I mentioned earlier, divorce, fighting, conflict within the family. On the flip side, any positive adult relationship, including with a family member or a mentor or a youth pastor or whoever, that is a protective factor. There's bonding that happens there. Opportunities for pro-social involvement, meaning maybe they're able to be in a sport or a club, or they have a really good social network, or they volunteer. Those are protective factors. And then recognition for positive behavior. When we as adults compliment the youth in our lives for the things that we like about them, the things that we see in them in positive ways, that helps to build that bonding and that self-efficacy as well. So to reduce some of those risk factors, I've put together a few things into this. These are some text-heavy slides coming at you, but the idea is that we'll talk to youth in our lives about online behavior and the impact that it's having. And a few slides from now, I actually have some conversation starting points to share with you. But we talk about how to spot someone who's unsafe. Again, scan your body. And if you're starting to get those spidey senses telling you that someone's asking you for a picture or someone's making you feel a little uncomfortable, but you feel like you have to react and support what they said, if they make a statement and you're not feeling okay about it, that's when you need to identify that person's not a safe person for you and how to get out of that. Give them the tools to get out of that conversation. The importance of not sending suggestive pictures. When I present this to youth, I tell them, don't send hot pics. That's what they call them, hot pics. I said, don't send hot pics. And I make them say it back to me. And it's fun. I did a national conference last year and I did this presentation. And throughout the rest of that conference of the week, when they would see me in the hallways, they would just shout, don't send hot pics. And it was wonderful because I was like, the message was received. They heard it. Because once it's out there, it's out there. And you can't control what the person who then possesses that image has and what they do with it, where they take that, who they send that to, how they use that. So that is one of the things that I stress to them. How to get out of those uncomfortable situations, talking through some options. And, that's really great for multiple reasons to give students in our lives that kind of talk. Hey, if you're offered a beer, what are you going to say? What's a comfortable response to say no? And the more that they rehearse and practice those before that situation arrives, hey, if someone asks you for a picture online, what are you going to say? How will you respond? And you can even offer, if you're the parent, you can say, you know what? Make me the bad guy. Say, no, my parents would kill me if I had a beer. They'll find out, I promise. Or hey, my parents check my phone regularly. I know they'll see that I sent this, so I can't do it. Make yourselves the bad guys if you need to. Put yourself out there. And then I also suggest using current news stories as starting points for conversations. There's a lot out there. And again, the algorithm can work for us. If you start searching for kind of some news articles around this toxic combination, whatever you feel like you want to search, you'll start getting more content around that. And so therefore you'd kind of be armed with more information and data. And again, the resources I share with you at the end will also be really helpful as conversation starting points. Encourage youth to set limits for themselves. And listen, my friends, we need to set limits for ourselves too. Model the behavior. But maybe you set timers on our apps. Don't use phones after 10. App limits themselves. I also have heard people talk about having like a charging station in the home where phones are locked up at nighttime. to be charged, but they're in a lockbox. Wi-Fi being shut off at nighttime. Now, granted, if their phones have data on them, then you would need a different strategy there, but just some ways that you can help them not lose sleep, let their brains, kind of reset for the next day so they can learn better in school, but also not be online and exposed to some of these negative things. Again, an encouragement to increase protective factors is that you can be a trusted adult, whether you have kids yourself or not. Those youth that you encounter, whether it's at your church or your neighborhood or whoever, you can be a trusted adult that they can talk to, open up about their online experience. They're not going to get in trouble. Let's just have a discussion about what's going on. Ask what's trending, who they've met online, how being online affects how they feel. And again, I've got some conversation starters coming up for you next. But we want to promote those healthy boundaries. Like I said, we need to model them and teach those refusal skills. So some conversation starters. And again, this comes from this online health and safety for children and youth best practices. I will share that with you at the very end because they have a few more, pages 23 and 24. But just take a look at these. These are some really helpful ways to start the conversation. First one is just kind of general. How do you feel about your use? Second one is about your family rules. Then maybe we could work together, but we want your input. That's really empowering for a young person to hear that their input's going to be valuable. We're going to set boundaries around technology, but I really want your input on what we do. And then the kind of that next piece about the algorithm. What are you seeing? What's kind of being highlighted in your feed? And by having these conversations, we are teaching youth to be very media literate. What are the messages that are being sent to me? What are the ads that are coming across my TV screen, my phone? How do I receive this information and process what this company is actually trying to get me to buy or to do or to believe? This is really good stuff to teach young people. And then the last one, let's talk about gaming. I've noticed these things about your gaming behavior, and I want to share those things and then hear from you. My goal is to get us on the same page about this. I love that because sometimes I do hear that that young people get off of a game and they're angry or they're frustrated because maybe they lost or they died or you forced them to get off because it's dinner time, whatever that is. And it creates this kind of like attitude that emerges. And you can talk about that and say, I really think that that's affecting your mood. So like I said, more on the document that I'll share with you at the very end, but some strategies that come from that document as well. Build a family media plan. And there is a tool in the resources of these slides, as well as on the document I'll send you, of how to create a family media plan. Balance time with and without devices. Set those rules in your home and live by them. Again, talk about social media, have conversations about it, set a good example yourself, and optimize your family's online experience. What is it that's allowed in your household? What is not? In continuing with some recommendations, building healthy relationships with media guide. This came from that specific document as well. Like I said, a lot of it came from that. It's 130 pages. So there's a lot of content, and I'm just giving you the kind of the cream of the crop of the top of what they talk about. But I loved this part. Make it a low drama part of the family. If there are fights happening around social media and phones and technology all the time, something's got to change. There shouldn't be tension about it. Let's make it a low drama part of the family. And this guide does help you sort of know how to do that. Normalize and model boundaries around it. Choose good content. How to choose good content. Talk about that. What does it make you feel like? Do you walk away from watching that show feeling good or feeling bad? Teach them non-screen ways to manage their boredom, to manage their emotions, teaching them how, and it's not going to be easy, but teaching them, hey, when I'm bored, I could go and I could pick up a puzzle, or I could go outside and shoot hoops, or I could find an activity for myself to do that I enjoy that isn't technology. Especially if I'm feeling a certain way emotionally. Teaching those safety skills, how to spot someone who's unsafe online, ways to get out of conversation. And then I liked this idea that came from this of sharenting. Think before you share. So share parenting, like kind of that idea. They're putting those words together, sharenting. Sharenting yourselves in terms of watching what you share. Think before you share. What is that content going to mean for someone? And I think a lot of us today could hear that message and look deeper into that idea. Then what I loved about this document, and this next slide actually has a compilation from multiple documents and multiple research out there about recommendations specific for the industry and policies around this issue. And as we're kind of landing the plane of our webinar here today, this is a really important thing for us to lean into. It is very important that we seek to promote policies in our nation that help protect our youth online. So this is a list of some different suggestions and possibilities, some of which have already been presented. I'll talk about that in just a second, but let's look at this list first. Ban targeted ads to those 16 and under. It's happening whether we realize it or not. These ads have a way to geofence, which means that they're finding the geographic location of people to be based on the demographics that are put into the app in terms of age. You have our ads targeted towards you online. I have ads targeted towards me online. I told you I'm a hiker. I get all kinds of different athletic wear companies trying to get me to buy their clothes or their backpacks, but it's happening to our 16-year-olds. Another thing is to keep children 13 or under 13 off the platform. They're not supposed to be on there right now anyway. So keeping them off there and having there be accountability to the tech companies to make sure that there's age verification of those users. Pushing for algorithmic transparency. Study the impact of what the algorithm is doing to us. How is it shaping our attitudes, our beliefs, our behaviors in terms of the content that we are fed online? For AI, there has to be the development of ethics and standards around it. Is AI a neat resource? Absolutely it is. And it's fun. I saw one Instagram carousel that had someone who put into AI, the largest theme park in the world. And it showed a pretty big theme park kind of somewhere on Earth, roller coasters and, flags, all kinds of stuff. And over the progression of 10 different times that they told it to do that and build it, the entire Earth became this really big, huge theme park. Huge roller coasters going up into space and all this. It was beautiful. It was a beautiful image to look at. Of course, we know it's not real, but it was beautiful to look at. There's some fun things about it, but AI has to be held accountable to what's able to be developed and therefore sent out. There should not be the ability to create a nude picture of someone who is fully clothed in their other images and just put their head on that body and make it look real. That should not be something that can be done because of all the ramifications of that. Banning individuals under 18 so that their accounts have to be private. That's some interesting legislation that could be passed. Higher data privacy for children. Strengthening enforcement of those age minimums. Like I said, maybe checking the verification of ID for those who are younger and making sure that they are actually 13 or older, which is a little bit tricky. 16, maybe there could be a check of ID, like a driver's license, but 13 is a little bit trickier. And I love this suggestion of requiring media literacy in schools. Pushing for schools to include content about the things that I'm talking about here, the impact and influence that social media has on us. I mentioned some of these have already been passed. I won't say too much about this because of time, but Senator Josh Hawley from Missouri actually introduced two bills in 2023, the Mature Act and the Federal Social Media Research Act. And you can read more about that online. Funny enough, I actually was in DC in February of this year on Capitol Hill, the day that Josh Hawley was questioning Mark Zuckerberg. And that was a really interesting experience just to be in Capitol Hill on that day. But all that to say, he has proposed some of these and you can follow the progression of those bills online. We're thankful for him putting that out there as just to get this conversation started with some of these things. So kind of in conclusion, the best way that I can summarize this is that the solution to isolation is connection. And those of us who have young people in our lives, whether they're our own biological or adopted children, we're guardians, we're aunts, we're uncles, we're grandparents, we're neighbors, we're in a faith-based institution, there are youth all around us. And we can build connection with them in a real way that will help them to mitigate a lot of these risk factors, help improve their skills. And the resources that I'll share with you, I hope will be really, really helpful to you in the long run. What I want to show you quickly is a video for Stand Against Trafficking that sort of gives a little bit of an introduction to who we are. And I just need to stop sharing for just a second to do so. But an introduction to who we are so that you can be aware of this coalition, and then I'll share those resources with you, and we will wrap up with any questions that you might have. So if you do have questions at this point, please do drop them in the chat or use that Q&A feature. But for now, you can watch this quick clip.
Stand Against Trafficking is a coalition that exists to eradicate human trafficking in the Ozarks. We do it by raising awareness in the community about what trafficking is and how you can intervene in situations that come up. Stand works within the community to provide education and awareness about human trafficking. This involves speaking to different groups, whether that be churches, hotels, law enforcement, attorneys, tattoo parlors, and more, in order to educate them on the signs to look for with human trafficking and ways that they can both get involved in the prevention efforts, but also be aware of what to do in the event that they spot someone they think might be involved in trafficking. Stand Against Trafficking Coalition has multiple partners that are involved in the coalition itself. These can include youth-serving organizations, businesses within the community, as well as the youth themselves and parents who are concerned. There are a lot of agencies that come to the table in order to help rally resources and also provide that education to their spheres of influence. You can get involved in Stand Against Trafficking Coalition in several different ways. The biggest way would be helping to spread awareness and the education that Stand Against Trafficking provides by sharing the videos that we have and social media posts, as well as offering for us to come and do presentations at your organization. Additionally, you can get involved in the actual coalition work. We meet on a monthly basis here in Greene County, and we talk about the action plan and strategies that we're going to do to help impact this issue. Finally, you can donate. Stand Against Trafficking exists solely because of the donations that have supported its work in the past through grants and donations that have been made, and so you can financially support Stand Against Trafficking as well.
So given that, I would just encourage you all to, if you feel passionate about the things we've talked about today, consider joining the fight with Stand Against Trafficking. If you're in the Missouri Southwest region, the work that they do is phenomenal. Meet monthly, first Monday of every month, in person and on Zoom. So if you're interested in more information, I've put our website here on the slide, as well as email if you'd like to reach out that way. And if you email us, you can absolutely get on the email list for our upcoming meetings. And Susan, if you wouldn't mind to type in the chat for me the Stand Against Trafficking email, just so that people can quickly grab that. And I put kind of tongue in cheek, you can also find us on social media. We have a social media account. We are very active and engaged in that social media presence because, like we said at the very beginning, social media is not all bad. It is a good way to get connection, to get support, to get information that maybe you didn't know. So as much as you can, like us, follow us, and share our posts so that we kind of can get that algorithm to be boosting our content. Just a quick note of the resources that I used here. I will make sure that the slides as well as the recording of this webinar are posted to our website within the next day or two. That's standagainsttrafficking.org, so that you can access these resources. But I have 2 pages worth of resources for you. And then I'm going to go ahead. We've got 3 minutes left for questions. If any of you have any, drop it in the chat. Otherwise, in the meantime, while I'm waiting for some questions, I'm going to go over to my browser and just drop those links that I promised you for those resources. So go ahead and drop any questions you have in the chat. What I'm putting here right now is the U.S. Surgeon General's advisory document. There's a link to that PDF. And then this is a link to that Building Healthy Relationships with Media, Essential Skills for Children 10 and Under. That was one of the things that I referenced. This link coming now is the Make a Family Media Plan. And then finally, the big one, the 130-page document. This is the task force that the Biden-Harris administration put together for the online health and safety for children and youth, best practices for families, and guidance for industries. That one's the mammoth, but it's a great resource for anyone looking to learn more about this topic and dig into some of those last slides of content. All right, well, I'm not seeing any questions pop up in the chat. So for the time being, we'll go ahead and stop recording, and thank you all for being here. Thank you for finding this important enough to stick around. I'll stay on even after the recording's off for another minute or two to make sure that no one has any questions, but have a great day and thank you for joining us.